Are you brave enough to face the darkness? Brace yourself, because tonight we're venturing into the realm of the truly terrifying. These aren't your average campfire stories or urban legends. These are bone-chilling tales of the unexplained and the macabre that will haunt your dreams long after the lights go out. Consider this your final warning, because once you hear these stories, there's no turning back.
One thing that I will never want in my life, and I am pretty confident that it will never happen to me, and that is sleep paralysis. Being stuck in a state where you can't move as you hallucinate in the dark sounds like something so villainous even Freddy Krueger wouldn't do it. He'd be like, at least kill them after, don't just let them sit there all night, that's gross. Luckily I sleep like a log, so there's no chance anything like that is going to happen to me, but for some others this can happen quite often. When people are stuck in sleep paralysis, it can be something as simple as having the feeling that someone is watching you as you're sleeping, while other people will have the heart feaster. A story online talked about a horrible entity that would come visit someone as they slept. They named this beast the heart feaster because it would lurk into their room when they couldn't move and then it would crawl on top of them. The creature looked like its body was made out of a dark crimson and it had long fingers that were almost like claws. Its face resembled a demon with a long pointed nose and jagged teeth. While this person was stuck and unable to move, the heart feaster would reach its long piercing fingers into their chest and pull out their heart and start eating it in front of them. Wow. At number 9 we have the Stalker. This next story was told by a young boy who grew up in a very old house. He said strange creaking noises coming from all over the home at any time of night was very common, but what wasn't common was something called the Stalker. Every now and again he would see something out of the corner of his eye. He wouldn't think that it was anything and he would just go on about his business. That was until he saw it. It was something he called the Stalker. He said it looked like the girl from The Ring, but it was on all fours. When he looked at it, the Stalker just stayed in one spot for what felt like an eternity. The ghost was locked in one spot until it scampered into another room. He told his parents about it, but he brushed it off and said it was a dream. However, our writer was certain that it happened because he went to investigate the spot where the Stalker was, and there were 2 wet handprints on the floor. At number 8 we have a short one. Some of my favorite ghost stories are the short ones. It's impressive what you can do with a few sentences. This one goes like this. I woke to the baby monitor crackling with a voice comforting my firstborn. As I adjusted to my new position, my arm brushed my wife sleeping next to me. Ooh, that is creepy. Coming in at number 7 we have imaginary friends. You would be surprised how many kids have imaginary friends that end up being ghosts. In fact, I did a multi-part series on Most Amazing Top 10 all about this. One of the most horrific stories I read about this was a young boy and girl used to have the same imaginary friend. It was just a voice that they would hear. It kept telling them to go into the woods behind their home. They would just ignore it and they really didn't think much of it. In fact, they didn't even know that the other sibling was hearing the voice until they brought it up with each other years later. The scariest part about this was when their younger sister, who was just old enough to talk, started saying that she could hear a voice that told her to go play outside in the trees. Ho ho. Coming in at number 6 we have glowing eyes. A girl was walking home late one night and she can feel something is off. She's not sure what it could be, but she knows she doesn't feel safe. She looks back over her shoulder and she sees a tall man in a trench coat who seems to be swaying side to side as he walks towards her. He's about 30 feet away and she can't make out his face except for a massive grin. This is obviously extremely frightening, so this young lady starts to move quickly, but it seems no matter how fast she moves, he keeps gaining on her. Eventually, she starts running and she can hear laughter start to come from behind her. She's now sprinting and looks back over her shoulder to see how close this man is, and the last thing she sees is the man right behind her with his massive eyes that are glowing red. Coming in at number 5 we have grave robbers. This is a pretty famous story about 2 young boys who wanted to give a scare to their friends. Now, is this story true or is it just an urban legend? It's hard to tell. Apparently there were 2 kids who loved to play pranks on people. One day they decided they wanted to play the ultimate prank by digging up a dead body and scaring their friends with it. So they went to the local graveyard in the middle of the night and they started digging. When they finally worked their way down to the body, they started cheering in excitement. The people living nearby heard the noises and they thought that the dead were rising from their graves. They ran and attacked the 2 boys, mistaking them for zombies. They were both killed and now their ghosts haunt the graveyard. Coming at number 4 we have Voodoo Priestesses of New Orleans. New Orleans Orleans has a long history of voodoo, and apparently there are people who live out in the bayou who have found a way to communicate with the dead. They will talk to the spirits of the dead who have been left to walk the earth without anyone to listen to them. Because these voodoo practitioners have spent the time learning how to talk to spirits, they can command power over them. They can use the dark magic of the dead to cast spells on people, bringing them misfortune. That really sounds like it sucks. Coming in number 3, we have another short one. Alright, we have room for one more short scary ghost story before I hit you with the top 2. I think this one might be my favorite short ghost story of all time, and it goes like this. My daughter won't stop crying and screaming in the middle of the night. I visit her grave and ask her to stop, but it doesn't help. Oh, that gives me goosebumps. Coming in at number 2, we have My Friend in the Basement. A young girl who is about 5 years old moves into a new home with her mom. The two of them love the place, but the mother notices something strange about her daughter. She spends a lot of time in the basement, talking and laughing like there's someone there. Sometimes she'll walk down to check on her to see who she's talking to, and every time there's no one there. One day her daughter comes back upstairs with a bite mark on her arm, and her daughter says, "Richard bit me." Her mom tells her that she is not allowed to play in the basement anymore. Then that night something attacks her daughter in her bed. The mother rushes in the room when she hears the poor daughter screaming. When she finds her daughter, she's still alive, but she has scratch marks all over her body. The next morning the two of them leave the home, never to return. And at the number 1 spot we have the taps. Something that ghosts love to do is turn on the taps and jack up your water bill. If you go online and search for this, you will find countless stories of ghosts who love to mess around with the water. This one was pulled off of Reddit, and it was about a young girl who was living alone, and she was often woken up by the sounds of running water. At first she thought that maybe she forgot to turn off the taps, but it started happening so frequently that she assumed that she was sleepwalking. But then it started happening when she wasn't home. Terrified that someone was breaking into her house when she wasn't there, she called the police. They came to check out the place, but they couldn't find anything. So her next best move was to set up cameras and spend the night at a friend's house. Then she saw it, the taps in the home turning on by themselves. Now it's time to go down the spiritual route and have someone come in and fix the ghost problem. A medium came through to contact the ghost, and it turns out there was a body of a girl who had been drowned in a tub that was in the home, who had been buried under the house. That is spook.
Starting off our list today with a story submitted to Reddit by user MaliaGirl1314 titled, "My wife is peeking at me." And honestly, this thing is pure nightmare fuel. It's long, so here's the cliff notes. Listen at your own risk. The story was written by a man about his wife Lynn, who he had been married to for 6 years and 11 months with no issues, until one day he caught her peeking. Just peeking at him from behind the wall. He thought it was strange because she wasn't one for pranks or games, but when he caught her, she ran away giggling like a schoolgirl. He was weirded out, but he shook it off, until about 3 days later. He went downstairs in the middle of the night for a drink of water and looked down at the floor to see his wife staring at him with wide eyes and a plastered on smile before scurrying away on all fours. Weeks later, while in the shower, he opened his eyes to see her head stretched into the shower, eyes red and unblinking, with the same creepy smile plastered across her face. He screamed and she ran, slamming the bathroom door behind her. Or so he thought, because when he stepped out of the shower, he got that same sinking feeling that he was being watched. He looked up to see his wife peering at him from the top of the closet door in the bathroom. He fled to his brothers, who a few nights later convinced him to return home and face his wife. The two went back to the house only to be met with a horrible stench and shattered glass strewn across the stairs. Lynn was nowhere to be found, and so the husband began packing up a bag. But when he opened the closet, he saw pairs of real eyeballs lined up along the closet floor. And then all of a sudden, there it was again, the sinking feeling that he and his brother were being watched. He peered under the bed to see his wife staring back at him, her hands stained red clasped together under her chin in excitement. She tried to attack him and his brother, but thankfully they managed to escape. They called the police, but she was never captured. The husband then went to stay in a motel, which is where he wrote the story, but it ends with him saying that all of a sudden he began to get that eerie feeling once more. And then a text popped up on his phone. just 3 words and a photograph. "I found you," and his wife's unblinking, smile-plastered face. Already covered in goosebumps. This next one was posted to Reddit by user Grey Bread, and it is called "I Know You're Awake." The story goes that one night, a young man was asleep in bed when all of a sudden he hears footsteps outside of his door. He holds the covers up and opens his eyes ever so slightly to see a large man stepping into his room, holding the dead bodies of both of the young man's parents. The large man then props the mother and father's lifeless bodies up in some chairs located at the corner of the room, and then takes the red seeping from their wounds and writes something on the wall before crawling underneath the young man's bed. It's dark, and so the young man can't quite make out what the message reads. He pretends to be asleep until his eyes adjust to the light, and he can finally read what the large man wrote on the wall. He gasps when he finally makes out the words, "I know you're awake." He then hears movement coming from underneath the bed. The next story was submitted to Reddit by user NSL Lewis, and it's called "My Wife Has a Removable Face." It was their 3rd date when Lewis leaned in to kiss Samantha. She stopped him and told him something he had never heard before, that she had a removable face. At first he assumed she was joking, but then she showed him the slight inconsistency at the bottom of her chin that proved that what she was saying was in fact true. She gave him the option to leave, but he stayed, and eventually the pair were engaged. Everything seemed normal except for the fact that once a day Samantha locked herself in the bathroom for an hour to clean her face. She would remove it and disinfect it, otherwise it would begin to smell and eventually rot. Lewis was never allowed to see her true face, nor was he allowed to know how the whole thing came to be. No one knew about Samantha's condition except for Lewis and his friend Chris, who he had drunkenly confessed the secret to one night on his bachelor's trip. Years later, after Lewis and Samantha had tied the knot, Chris came to visit them in their home. While Lewis was on a work call, Samantha went upstairs to freshen up, and that is when Chris's curiosity got the best of him. Using a paperclip, he unlocked the bathroom door where Samantha was cleaning her face, and then all of a sudden Lewis heard screaming. He ran upstairs to find Chris in hysterics, using the same paperclip he had used to get into the bathroom to repeatedly impale his eyes, while Samantha screamed, "He looked! Call the police! He looked!" Chris was taken into hospital, seizing and covered in bodily fluids. When the story was written, Chris had been admitted to the hospital, now completely blind and virtually unresponsive, save his frequent fits of violent paranoid mania. Samantha is distraught at what has happened to Chris, and Lewis is more curious than ever to see his wife's real face. For this next one, I thought I'd take the time to rattle off 2 two-sentence horror stories I found while exploring the dark world of scary Reddit. The first story comes from Reddit user according_rise602, and it goes, "My mother called me and told me she was 20 minutes away and to shut and lock all the doors and windows. But I can see her and dad standing in the driveway with big smiles calling my name." The second two-sentence horror story was posted by user OK_relationship_4162. "Every night I hear my closet door open and heavy breathing, but I tell myself it's nothing and then go back to sleep. Tonight when I heard the door open, I closed my eyes, but when the breathing got louder, I opened them to see that whatever had been hiding in my closet was now standing over me with its jaw unhinged, revealing many layers of sharp teeth." This next story was posted to Reddit by user Grand Theft Motto. I will be calling him Motto, and it's called "Something Walks Whistling Past My House Every Night at 3:03. When Motto moved into a new neighborhood with his family, they were greeted by a welcoming committee who told them about how the neighborhood was extremely good to those who lived there, in that it brought them an immense amount of luck in the form of a million little blessings. Motto and his family had actually seen these blessings firsthand, as shortly after moving into the neighborhood, Nola, Motto's sister, was finally able to breathe on her first time without the use of an iron lung, and she started becoming healthy and growing normally after such a rocky start in life. While this was fantastic, the welcoming committee also had a warning for the family. Never look for the source of the whistles heard throughout the neighborhood from 3:03 to 3:05 a.m. Those who do experience tragedy and great misfortune, as well as having the life completely drained from their bodies. The family family followed the rules to a T, with Motto's father even buying heavy-duty blinds that he locked each and every night to keep himself, his wife, Motto, and Nola from ever looking for the source of the whistling. All was well and the blessings were plenty until one night Motto had a friend, Holden, over to spend the night. He was new to the neighborhood and he didn't seem to take the whistling as seriously as everyone else did. Holden managed to steal a key from Motto's father, and at 3:03, right as the whistling began, he went over to the blinds, unlocked them, and looked out the window. Motto shielded his and Nola's eyes while Holden screamed and closed the blinds. Motto's parents woke up and then joined the three downstairs right before the knocking started. Loud pounding on the front door, then the back, then the windows, then the walls, then all at once, and it only stopped when Holden yelled out, "I promise I won't tell them what I saw." Silence, and then just a small tapping on the window for the rest of the night. The next morning, Motto's father took Holden back to his house, and that day, Holden and his family left the neighborhood, their bodies moving somewhat limp and the life completely drained from their eyes. Okay, this next story was submitted to Reddit by user sufficient_moose67. It's a story that they were told when they were young, one that I have also heard when I was young, and it haunted my dreams for years. It's called Dogs Aren't the Only Ones Who Lick. Story goes that one day a woman living alone felt a lick on her hand. She looked down to see her dog standing next to her. A few days went by, again she felt a lick on her hand, but this time her dog was about a step away. Thinking that he had licked her hand and taken a step back, she thought nothing of it and went about her day. The next day, she felt a lick, but when she looked down, she didn't see her dog. In fact, the dog was standing at the other side of the room. The next day it happened again. This time, her dog was asleep in the room next to hers. A few days later, she felt another lick, but this time, her dog was nowhere to be found. She looked high and low around her home before finally checking the bathroom. The curtain was closed in the shower, and so she opened it to reveal the lifeless body of her dog and a message written in BLOOD that read, "Dogs aren't the only ones who lick." Next up, we have a story submitted by do-tomatillo5363 that I like to call Cleaner Together. It's pretty short, so here goes. I was taking a shower and decided to wash my hair. As I was washing it, some shampoo had gotten into my eyes. As I was using my hands to wipe the shampoo out of my eyes, I felt as though something was standing in front of me. I opened them quickly and I saw something. I closed them in panic, and when I opened them again, I didn't see anything. So I went back to rinsing out my eyes when all of a sudden I realized that something was still scrubbing the back of my head. I mean, as if closing your eyes in the shower wasn't already scary enough, now you have to worry about whatever the heck that thing was. Hell no. I'm so beyond over scary shower stories at this point, it's actually unreal. I'm changing all my shower curtains for doors and wearing goggles in the shower. Okay, it's getting pretty creepy up in here, so let's throw in another two-sentence horror stories for good measure. The first was submitted by Federal-Hornter01671, and it goes like this. I was tossing and turning all night because I felt like something was crawling over my skin. It wasn't until I went into the bathroom and looked into the mirror that I realized it was actually because something was crawling in it. Gross. Yeah, think about that. Think about bugs under your skin when you're going to sleep tonight. Next story comes from user Miami Metro, and it goes, growing up with cats and dogs, I got used to the sounds of scratching at my door while I slept. Now that I live alone, it's much more unsettling. Oh god, I feel like with that one, we're looking down the barrel of a Dogs Aren't the Only Ones Who Lick sequel called Cats Aren't the Only One Who Scratch. Big no for me. Let's move on. Next story comes from Reddit user It's a Miracle, who said that they used to sleepwalk when they were younger, often waking up outside in the middle of the night before making their way back into the darkened doorway of their home, where they had left the doors wide open as almost an invitation to whomever might be lurking around in the night. One night, however, they had a different experience. In their sleep, they had walked over to the window on the ground floor and drawn the curtains fully open, when all of a sudden they came to and were face to face with a large, completely hairless man inching closer and closer towards the window. Frozen in place, they let out a loud scream before emptying their bladder onto the floor. The man outside the window then screamed himself before running off into the night. When the user, It's a Miracle, told his mother what had happened, she thought it must have been a dream, until they went outside and they found a screwdriver on the front porch along with damage to the door jamb and door handle. Thank God for sleepwalking, I guess. And we're going to finish things off today with two-sentence horror stories because they creep me out, and I want you to think about these as you crawl into bed tonight. The first comes from user Just Another Muffled Vo and reads, as I began tucking him into bed, he tells me, "Daddy, check for monsters under my bed." I look underneath for his amusement, but to my horror, I see another him staring back at me, quivering as he whispers, "Daddy, there's something on my bed." And finally, for our last bedtime story, we have 2 sentences posted by Unbreakable Ned that read, I lay shaking underneath my blanket, hiding from the monster, too afraid to move. All of a sudden, I heard him say, blankets aren't weapon-proof, before unzipping his bag. So yeah, if you were planning on hiding under your blanket because you're freaked out after this video, don't bother, it doesn't work. Thanks, Unbreakable Ned.
Number 10. Ghost of the Dead. This worker said, we had a younger man a few weeks ago who passed suddenly. One night after closing up and hitting the lights, we walked towards the back hallway. As I looked down the hall before heading out the door, I saw a man with dark hair and a dark suit at the end, just standing there. I thought it was a director, and when I blinked, he was gone. The director with me that day was in a light gray suit and had blonde hair. The next day, I went to close the casket in the chapel. Lo and behold, it was the same gentleman that was in the hallway the day before. 2 of my coworkers said they experienced similar events, such as when walking past his casket, they felt they bumped into someone, but no one was there. That is creepy, I'm telling you. Ugh. Number 9. Stolen body. Julie Mott, who lost her life battling against cystic fibrosis, left behind a mysterious case post her death. While the funeral should have been a part of the grieving process for her friends and family, the funeral was the start of a new nightmare. Sometime after the visitation and just before closing of the funeral home, someone took Julie's body. Yeah, they just left with it. The police and family were stunned to hear this, for no one knows who actually stole the body. Theories of an obsessive unidentified boyfriend, involvement of the funeral home itself have been formed, but it is still unknown as how and where did Julie's body disappear. Now this is scary and just sad. How can someone disappear with a dead body and no one noticed? Number 8. Ghost lady. This worker said, most nights as we were returning to quarters from a run, my partner and I would scope the parking lot for vagrants or people who shouldn't be there before we opened the bay doors. While looking on more than one occasion, we would see a light on in the adjacent building on the top floor, and there should have been no lights on. Figuring someone had gotten inside, we would watch the building for more lights. No other lights ever came on, but on every occasion, a young woman in a dress would come to the window and stare at us. One night after seeing the figure, we got brave and called some law enforcement friends from the area to help us search the building. We went to the room that had the light on expecting to find a vagrant camped out there, but the only thing we found was a room that had untouched dust on the floor and no light bulbs in the sockets. We got the willies and split, and we never went back to that building at night. Yeah, I would never go back to that building. Ever. Like, that sounds terrifying. Number 7. Missing head. In July 1986, Anthony Parisi passed away at the age of 83. Anthony, a co-founder of a grocery store in Mount Vernon, New York, died of natural causes. He was sent to a funeral home, and on July 26, the employees of the funeral home went to prepare him for his burial, but when they looked into his casket, they discovered that his head was missing. Yeah, just his whole head, just poof. Gone. The police were called, and they speculated that someone broke into the funeral home during midnight and used a razor or scalpel to remove the head. Once the head was cut off, the intruder took it with them. Nothing else in the funeral home was stolen or perturbed. There weren't even signs of break-in. The police were baffled by the case, and they have no idea who stole the head, why it was stolen, and they don't know what happened to it because it was never found. Number 6. Spirits of the Dead. This online user said, my grandpa was a mortician for a small town in the late 60s. The morgue was attached to the house that my mom lived in. One day, her boyfriend Tom came over to the house and no one was home. They'd been dating for a while and he was comfortable going inside and waiting for my mom to come home. On the way into the house, Tom noticed that the door and windows into the morgue were open, so he checked it out, found it empty, closed everything, and went into the house. A few minutes later, he heard a loud loud slamming noise come from the morgue, so he ran to see what was wrong and found that the doors and windows had been thrown fully open again. He got out of there real quick, and when he told my grandpa about what happened, my grandpa just calmly explained that they had picked up a deceased woman that morning and the spirits were welcoming her and visiting with her. Next time, Tom should just leave the doors and windows open. Number 5. Doppelganger. This worker says, I was once working at a mortuary and had to pick up a man from the medical examiner's office. When you do that, at least where I'm from, you get the receipt when they release the body to you. The receipt has all the personal belongings that are with the deceased. When I brought the man back to the office, I opened up the body bag to make sure all the belongings were there and double checked the receipt. When I opened up the bag, I was stunned to find this dude looked almost exactly like me. He was my age, had similar tattoos and similar spots, had the same long hair I do, even had the same style of jewelry I was wearing. It took me so off guard that I stood there in an existential crisis until the embalmer came in and was like, hey, how's it going? Ah, holy that guy looks like you. It's the only case I've had nightmares about that I'll be the one in the body bag with the deceased man opening it up. Now that sounds absolutely horrifying and I can't imagine that happening. Number 4. New home. A family bought a funeral home and turned it into a house, which, like, why? But this is what the father said of the experience. Many people that have worked here or rented have told me about hearing sounds and seeing black shadows during all hours. One of the things that turned me to wonder about all of this even more is the children saying things about a black fog in different rooms during the night. It's apparent that something is causing all of this: whispers in the hallway, lights going out and coming back on, leaving rooms with lights on and seeing them turn off, even water turning on and off. Finally, when people remodeling came to me and said something about a high-pitched drilling noise from the basement one afternoon, I told myself and my wife I'd humor everyone and speak with a local psychic. I did so the same afternoon of the drilling, and the psychic was a nice lady, but I was frustrated that all she kept saying and insisting to me was that I shouldn't remodel and stir up the spirits in the building, and I am causing nothing but problems some people in the community would choose to forget. Before the phone call ended, I remember very well the last thing she said: you, sir, are playing with fire. So after a few days, I called a local Christian preacher who prayed for me and claimed I was involved in a demonic process and should come to church Sunday morning before it's too late. He did finally come over to the building and did some water sprinkles of whatever it is called around the place, but when he left, everything started freaking out. Lights would turn off and on, and we would start getting lightheaded sometimes when we walked through areas of the building. So now, ever since that day, my wife won't stay in a room alone when we are here. We still don't really have any clear answers on the building, the items inside, or its terrible history, but after we finish remodeling, we hopefully clean and rid ourselves of the spirits of Jacob's funeral home. Now, this is literally the beginning of a horror movie, and they should move out. Like, right now. Number 3. Peeking from the hallway. This is a story about someone's childhood experience. They said, there aren't many options in my town for funeral homes, so almost everyone in town has been to all of them at some point in their lives for service. I remember as a child sitting on a chair in the lobby of one of the more prominent funeral homes, bored out of my mind during a visitation for a distant relative. A kid I knew from school walks up and says hi, and we start to chat when something catches my eye. Far down the hallway, going into a closed off area of the funeral home, I see the hands of an old man come around the corner and grasp onto the wall. Slowly, the old man peeks his head around the corner and just stares blankly down the hallway into the visitation room. I'm thoroughly weirded out, and I look over at my friend who is staring down the hall. He turns to me and says, "What is he doing?" When we look back, the man is gone. I'm sorry, but the image of that is absolutely terrifying. I hate it. I have goosebumps. No. He continued on by saying, we didn't ever really talk about it again until 20 years later when I got a call from my old friend out of the blue. He says, this is going to sound crazy, but do you remember the old man at the funeral home? It was a little hazy on it, but I did remember. He continues to say, well, I was just there and my daughter saw him. During the viewing for my Uncle Bill, she came over and asked my wife why the creepy man down the hallway was staring around the corner at was staring around the corner at Uncle Bill, and there wasn't anyone there, man. I could hear the fear in his voice and I instantly got chills. I have been back to that funeral home many times now and I've not seen anything else, but I still get uneasy anytime I walk past that hallway, and yeah, that makes sense. Number 2. Body moved by itself. This online user said my neighbor a while back before I moved in was a mortician. One night he had a body he was preparing for a very early morning wake or service. Whatever was going on, it was unusual and it required him to work in the wee hours in the morning on this particular corpse. So as he's working on it, he turned his back to grab some tools or supplies, and the angle he was standing at with regard to the corpse left the body visible just out of the corner of his eye. As he was looking down at whatever tools he was getting, in the corner of his eye he saw the body slowly start to sit up. His fight or flight instinct immediately kicked in and he ran to the stairs as fast as he possibly could, but he was so clumsy trying to get up the stairs he tripped and was pretty much crawling and clawing his way to the top. He was just near the top before his senses finally came back and he knew it was rigor mortis. He collected himself and started to laugh at how absurd it was. He'd been doing this for 15 to 20 years at that point, and he had never had a freakout like that before where instinct took over knowledge and experience. He actually sheepishly admitted he had to go clean himself because he had soiled his pants in a panic. Dead bodies do weird things, I'm telling you. But I would probably have to change my pants too if that happened to me. And coming in at number 1 is waking up. This is a story a user posted online saying when my cousin was 18, he was in a bad wreck, and he, his girlfriend, and his sister were all pronounced dead at the scene. The police arrived to inform my aunt, his mom, and she asked that he be sent to a specific funeral home. While they were preparing to embalm him, he raised up and asked, "Where the hell am I?" Yep. He wasn't actually dead. The funeral director said it was the first time he had ever had to go home and change his pants. I should add that the top of his head was open and his brain was exposed. He was sent to the hospital, and the same police officer came to my aunt's to tell her he was not dead, but in the hospital. They thought he'd be in a vegetative state. But a few weeks later, he walked out of the hospital. He has horrible headaches on occasion, but he's led a successful life and he's a great guy. I mean, what a positive turn of events, but that would be so shocking. It's one thing for the body to move on its own, but speak, that's on a whole new level.
Coming in number 10, we have bread got you high. You know nowadays when you go to the grocery store and buy some bread to make a breakfast sandwich with some eggs, some cheese, some bacon, and some hollandaise sauce on it, you don't have to worry about if the bread is going to make you high or kill you. Well, back in the Middle Ages, people didn't have that luxury. Back then, there were several periods when there wouldn't be enough bread to go around. People would start to go hungry and they would get desperate, so they would turn to using their stored rye grain to make some bread. And even though rye would be the choice toast for some people today, it would seem that back then you would be at high risk for ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that would love to jump on rye and call that place home. But it doesn't exactly jive with the human body. It turns out that ergot, when ingested, will cause a person to hallucinate. They will get high off the bread. If the contamination is really bad, they could also get gangrene. Coming in at number 9, we have couples combat. When you get into a disagreement with your spouse or partner, what do? Maybe you give them the silent treatment, maybe you talk it out, maybe you just bottle it all up inside you until one day you explode on each other and break up in a horrible fashion. All of those are great options, but what about back in medieval Germany? Well, you would fight, of course, UFC style combat, the two going head to head in the battle of the ages. But if you're reading this, you must be thinking, well, that doesn't seem like a fair fight. There's a reason why we have a men's league and a women's league when it comes to combat sports. Well, they would even the playing field in one of the funniest ways possible. The man would be given a couple of things to hinder his ability to fight off his wife. He would be forced to stand in a hole so he would be shorter, and he would have one of his hands tied behind his back. And the wife would be given an upgrade, a bag of rocks, so she could now be a formidable force. Honestly, that seems like the best way to solve an argument with a couple. And also seems like the next combat sport I want to see on TV. Coming in at number 8, we have the merchant's life. When I learn about medieval times, I always like the life of a merchant or shepherd. Both of them just just got to travel around the world and sell their goods. Mind you, the merchant would become much richer than the shepherd in most cases, but I wouldn't be in it for the money. I would just want to see what the world has to offer. With all of the exotic items that a merchant would carry from city to city to see what the commoner or king would be seduced into buying from him, this would of course bring in a ton of threat. The average merchant would have to worry about being attacked by bandits and have their life and all of their goods stolen from them, and they might even be killed if they were crossed by the wrong villain. Coming in at number 7, we have most people didn't care about church. Now this isn't a scary point for me, and for most people watching this video it won't be a scary point at all, but some people find it frightening to think that people aren't going to church, and it's kind of frightening to think that more people are entrenched in religion now than they were back then, or it might have been around the same amount. I haven't done enough research to really let you guys know, but even though the more salacious parts of film and television and books make it seem like everything was ruled by the church back then, there's a lot of people who didn't care about religion at all, or even believe in having religious beliefs or did anything that was religious. They saw how it didn't matter at all as to how holy you were as to a reflection of your success or well-being or happiness. Most people questioned the idea that God made the crops grow, because why would he make them stop growing if a person did nothing wrong? There were also plenty of people that didn't believe in a soul. I mean, it makes sense. I have never seen one or anything close to it caught on camera, so back then when your life was crops and trying to not die out of nowhere, religion probably was on the back burner. Coming in at number 6, we have you didn't get to pick your job. You know how when you look out at the world today, people say you can do anything, which is kinda true. You can do most things if you work hard and have a passion for it, but as far as I know, not every single person in the world has an opportunity at every job. Let's be realistic. But at least you have some pretty good options. Your job isn't picked for you before you even get out the womb. But back in the Middle Ages, you probably just got the same job as your parents unless you showed exceptional skill in another area, and even if you were very skilled in something else, your chance to prove to other people that you could do that would be slim, and you would most likely just get stuck in your old man's gig. Is he a cobbler? Well, then I hope you like shoes and know how to use a little hammer, because guess what? That's what you're going to be doing for the rest of your life. Making and breaking shoes, baby. Coming in at number 5, we have most people couldn't read. You know how today we have everyone tweeting and posting about their life? You have so much to read out there, and only a small percentage of it is actually worth looking at. Sometimes you wish that there was way more people who couldn't read or write, because it would make the world and internet so much quieter. Less options to throw around. Well, back in the Middle Ages, most of the people couldn't read. Most people could just farm and poop and die at age 31. That was all they knew how to do, and they were perfectly fine with that. They never wanted anything more. And guess what? Even if you could write, it wasn't seen as a great illustrious skill. It was kind of a labor job. Like it would have been above digging a hole, but not by much. People who wrote books were just scribes who would write down the words of other people, and lots of the time they would just be copying the words down from another book, so you could just have more copies of that book. You know how many times there was probably mistakes in those books if they all had to be copied by hand? Well, it was actually a very common thing. It was so common that monks who were in charge of scribing would say that a little demon was the one who was watching them make their mistakes and cataloging all of them. Those mistakes would have been taken in front of God when you died and were being judged. That was the motivation to make sure that you were good at your job. Should you get more pay and better work conditions? No, they want the fear of God thrown into your heart. That was the motivation for most things back then. Coming in at number 4, we have the trade system was interesting. Here's the thing, when you're using the barter or trade system, it can sometimes seem like there are rules that have to go down. But other than I give you something for something else, there are no rules. You can trade whatever you want for whatever else thing you want. Like, do you want a chair? Well, what if I give you some hair for that chair? If that's something of value that you want from me, then whoop-de-doo, you have yourself some hair and I got myself a chair. But sometimes the currency chosen was even weirder than hair. There were several records of people using eels to trade. Someone once traded 20,000 eels so they could rent some farmland. Now, these are a bunch of old documents, so who knows what was actually traded, because I don't know if someone gets their hands on 20,000 eels. That just seems like way too many eels. Like, I would rather have way less of something else that has a much higher value. What am I going to do with all of these eels in the Middle Ages? I don't have a fridge, so there's nowhere I could keep them. I would have to cook them right away and have some sort of eel party where everyone is eating eels, and I feel like I would attract some strange people that I wouldn't want to be friends with at this eel cookout. Coming in at number 3, we have the food sucked. Food is one of the many pleasures pleasures in life. It feels great to scarf down something delicious as you sit in front of the TV to consume some show that you're half watching as you scroll through your phone. Well, back then the pleasure would have been almost nowhere to be found. Could you imagine a time when fine dining was eating an egg? They didn't even have anything to put on it. It was just a regular egg that was probably hard boiled. A hard boiled egg would have been like going to Jacob's Steakhouse and spending $500. An egg! You didn't even have salt to put on the egg unless you were rich. They had wars over spices. That was a real thing. That's how lame the food was back then. All you could eat was plain bread, some stews where you'd mix a bunch of random veg that you could find, and then an egg for Christmas. Coming in at number 2, we have the living situation. Moving out of your house and living on your own is one of the best things you can ever do with your life. You get the freedom of the world thrown at you, and you are now free to do whatever you want. No one can tell you to wash that pan because now you're alone and the master of your own domain. Well, that was never the situation back in the Middle Ages. If you watch movies that are based in that time period, we see royals who could actually bathe and have massive castles, when that was not even close to the reality for most people. The majority of people lived in homes with a couple of rooms that was probably built on the earth that they lived on with some bricks if they were lucky. The whole family would sleep in one room because it would be a warmer situation and there would be livestock living in the house. So you would have some farts from the whole family plus farts from your farm animals all circulating as you slept. It's no wonder that no one would live into their 40s. Everyone's brain was full of methane. You couldn't even get a good night's sleep to save your life. And coming at the number 1 spot, we have a wildlife. You know how today when you're on your way to work you don't have to worry about a bear or cougar jumping out at you and trying to rip your skull off of your body like you're a kid pulling its head off of its action figure? Well, guess what? Back then that wasn't the case at all, especially if you lived on the countryside. Bears were all over the place. Cougars would eat your livestock, and if you weren't careful, even things like pigs. Back then you had to watch out for boars. They would all have tusks and come to gorge life right out of your body. Basically, everything was trying to kill you all the time.
The Taman Shud case is one of the most baffling, mysterious, unsolved homicides in the world. He had no identification, no signs of violence, and no apparent cause of death. It was all just a mystery. The only clue to his identity was a piece of paper with the words Taman Shud, meaning ended or finished in Persian, that was found in a hidden pocket of his trousers. Not suspicious at all. The paper matched a rare edition of a book of poems called the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which was later found in a car near the beach. The book had a phone number and a code written on the back cover, but neither led to any conclusive answers. There's been intense speculation ever since regarding the identity of this man, the cause of his death, and the events leading up to it. Public interest in the case remains pretty significant for several reasons. The death occurred at a time of heightened international tensions following the beginning of the Cold War, the apparent involvement of a secret code, the possible use of an undetectable poison, and the inability or unwillingness of authorities to identify the dead man. But regardless, seems like we'll never know who this mystery man was or why he died. In 2001, Armin Mewis from Germany posted an advert looking for a well-built 18 to 30-year-old to be slaughtered and then consumed. Yeah, he was a people eater. Throughout his childhood, Armin fantasized that if he were to eat someone, they would be with him forever, so he would never be lonely again. Anyone who that was these weird thoughts like that, like if I just eat someone, they'll be with me forever. That's not how food works, guys. It gets used as energy. You take dumps. Do you not take dumps? The food leaves. Not only is it an evil thing to do, but it also just scientifically makes no sense, which seems to anger me more than the evil part. Anyway, more disturbingly, many people actually replied to the advert, but all of them got cold feet, obviously, apart from one man who ended up meeting up with Armin. Armin made a video of him dismembering his victim. Armin amputated the victim's nether regions, and they both attempted to eat it, but it was too chewy. No comment. The man then took 20 sleeping pills to end his own life, but this was not a success, and he slowly bled out from the amputation. Armin then ended the man's life by slicing his throat and consumed the remains over a period of 10 months. He was sentenced to life imprisonment after stating to a psychiatrist that his fantasies of devouring people had not subsided. Can't imagine the trauma investigators had to go through, like actually watching that video, because just like reading reading that out loud, it's disturbing me a little bit, honestly. British Columbia, Canada is home to one of the most gruesome and baffling discoveries within the past few decades. Since 2007, at least 16 severed human feet and running shoes have been found on its shores. Although some of the feet have been identified, it's still unknown why the feet were detached and how they got in the sea. The latest solved case involving a human foot was completed in 2019, for a foot discovered in 2018. In September of that year, a left foot was found inside a blue sock and light gray Nike running shoe. That shoe and foot matched information police had in a missing person report from 2018. The family of that missing person was contacted and provided samples for DNA testing, which matched the DNA samples from the foot. Since then, there have been other feet found, as one was found in 2021 and one found in July of 2023. Next, we have the crime solved by a ghost. Yes, a homicide case was solved with the help of a ghost. In 1977, Teresita Botha was a respiratory therapist who worked at a hospital in Chicago. She was found stabbed to death and burned in her apartment on February 21st. The police had no suspects or leads until they received a very unusual tip from another hospital employee named Remy Chua. Remy claimed that she had been possessed by the spirit of Botha, who told her that the person responsible for the crime was a man named Alan Showery, who also worked at the hospital. Remy said that Alan had come to Botha's apartment to fix her TV and then robbed her and ended her life. The police were skeptical, but decided to give an investigation a go anyway. They found out that he had some of Botha's jewelry and that he gave it to his girlfriend as a gift. He also matched the description of a man seen leaving her apartment on the day of her death. Alan confessed to the crime and was convicted in 1979. The case remains one of the few examples of paranormal evidence being used in court. I do wonder though, with this one, that makes me wonder, like, did Remy just know something? Was she kind of in on this somehow and then kind of tipped them off? I don't know, that seems highly suspect. I'd ask her a few more questions if I was them. The high-fi deaths that occurred in 1974 are still a shock today. Three men, Dale Shelby, William Andrews, and Keith Roberts, entered the hi-fi shop in Ogden, Utah, just before closing time. They then held the store workers Stanley Walker and Michelle Ainsley hostage in the basement before robbing the store. Later, Brian Naisbitt entered the store as he was running errands and was also taken hostage. Both Byron's mother, Carol Peterson Nesbitt, and Stanley's father, Orrin Walker, arrived at the store to look for their where they suffered the same fate. They were taken hostage. After this, the hostages were forced to drink a corrosive liquid that caused their lips, tongues, and throats to burn and the flesh to peel away from their skin. The hours of torment also included the use of a ballpoint pen as a weapon, and 3 of the hostages were shot dead. The 2 surviving victims, Orrin Walker and Byron Nesbitt, sustained permanent life-changing injuries. The twisted criminals were put to death by lethal injection, all except for Keith Roberts, who was charged with aggravated robbery and sentenced to life imprisonment. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris were a serial slaying duo who ended the lives of 5 girls in the most sinister way possible. The victims had been kidnapped on the highways of Southern California over a period of 5 months in 1979. The criminals used an ice pick, screwdriver, vice grips, and pliers to subject them to the worst kind of physical pain. They also recorded the screams of their victims. Retired Los Angeles County Deputy District Attorney who prosecuted the 2 was still haunted by the evidence for years after the trial, saying that I would hear the girls screaming and I was running to go get them, and then too late. So the pair sat on death row for decades and ended up dying of natural causes. So one weird thing about death row, like, why do people sit on death row for ages? Just like, all right, we're sentencing you to death. Do it. What are they sitting around for? What's the point? Anyway, next up we have the Ripper Crew. The Ripper Crew was a satanic cult and gang who in the 80s abducted and ended the lives of multiple women at random in the Chicago area until authorities apprehended them. The group consisted of Robert Gecht and 3 associates, Edward Spreitzer and brothers Andrew and Thomas Kokorellis. They were suspected in the deaths of 17 women in Illinois in 1981 and 82, as well as the unrelated fatal shooting of a man in a random drive-by. According to one of the detectives who investigated the case, Gecht made Manson look like a Boy Scout. Thomas Kokorellis was released from prison on March 29th of 2019, just horrifying the victims' families. He served half of his 70-year sentence after pleading guilty. In an interview with WBBM-TV, Thomas proclaimed his innocence, saying that everybody thinks I'm a monster, but I'm not a monster. Sylvia and Jenny Likens were born to 2 carnival workers who regularly traveled around the country. During one of their parents' trips in 1965, the girls were left in the care of Gertrude Bensweski, who agreed to house them for a weekly $20 payment. But when this money began coming in late, Gertrude took out her anger on the Likens girls. Eventually, she directed the extreme mistreatment almost entirely at Sylvia, sometimes to the point of starvation. Sylvia's maltreatment came not only from Gertrude, but also from her children and other neighborhood kids, culminating in Sylvia's tragic death on October 26th of 1965. Police officers found her body laid on a filthy mattress, and she was covered in more than 150 burns and cuts. It was clear at first that she'd starved to death, as she was little more than skin and bone. Later, it was found that she died of a brain hemorrhage and malnutrition. Gertrude served less than 20 years in prison for some reason. On August 23rd of 2003, Pennsylvania resident Brian Wells delivered his last pizza. At the location of his delivery, Brian allegedly was coerced into strapping an explosive around his neck with instructions to complete 4 tasks in exchange for his life. The first objective was to shake down a PNC bank, which Brian tried to comply with, but it was not meant to be a harmless stick-up, as the people who affixed the device to Brian gave him a homemade single barrel. He completed the robbery, but the police arrived and arrested him. They handcuffed him, and he desperately explained that he had a bomb around his neck. As police moved away and tried to clear the area, the bomb went off, and Brian died instantly. Inside Brian's car, police found 9 pages of handwritten instructions addressed to bomb hostage, directing him to rob the bank. The instructions also included a scavenger hunt, listing a series of strictly timed tasks of collecting keys that would delay detonation and eventually defuse the bomb. The pages warned that Brian would be under constant surveillance, and any attempts to contact authorities would result in the bomb's detonation. Act now, think later, or you will die was also scrawled at the bottom of the instructions. Then, in a complicated investigation, a woman named Marjorie D.L. Armstrong was found responsible for the crime and was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. American justice system, like the court system, is so weird with that kind of thing. It's life. How do you do more than life? Let me tell you, this last case is disturbing but also kind of inspiring. On December 18th of 1994, Allison Botha was abducted near her home in South Africa. Her captors, later identified as Frans de Toit and Theuns Kruger, took her to a deserted area on the outskirts of town. There, they took advantage of her, disemboweled her, and slashed her throat so deeply that she was nearly decapitated. They stabbed her at least 30 times in the abdomen. They slit her throat 16 times. Do you think she's dead? One of the attackers asked. No one can survive that, the other replied. Finally, they left her for dead in a clearing, apparently satisfied that they had ended her life. The pair drove away, but little did they know that Allison was still breathing, lying alone atop sand and broken glass. She decided to write the names of her attackers in the dirt, knowing that she was going to pass away, and then beneath that she wrote, "I love Mom." In the distance she could see headlights streaking through the bushes. When she moved towards the headlights, she realized the full extent of her injuries. She pulled herself up, and then her head started to fall backwards. Meanwhile, she could also feel something slimy protruding from her abdomen, which were her own intestines. She had to use one hand to keep her organs from spilling out, and the other hand to literally hold up her head. As she laid on the road, someone spotted her, and she was saved. She was on the brink of death, but actually managed to pull through. She also remembered everything about her attackers. She was soon able to identify them from police pictures while she was still in the hospital. Like, that is incredible. Absolute hero right there. She lived.
Starting us off at number 10 is Dan Cooper. Back
Back in 1971, a man who went by the alias Dan Cooper hijacked a commercial plane, and no one has ever been able to find him since. According to those involved, shortly after takeoff, he handed a note to a flight attendant claiming to have a bomb in his briefcase. He demanded 4 parachutes and $200,000 in $20 bills, which is the equivalent of like $1.2 million nowadays. Otherwise, he was going to kill everyone on the plane. After the flight landed in Seattle, Cooper released the 36 passengers once authorities had provided him with the money and parachutes, but kept both pilots, 1 flight engineer, and flight attendants as hostages on the plane. From there, he forced them to fly to Mexico City, but somewhere over Nevada, Cooper jumped off the plane with the stolen cash. The FBI launched a massive search that is still considered one of the longest and most exhaustive investigations in FBI history, but Dan Cooper has yet to be found, and I'm sure many agents lost sleep over trying to figure out this case. Moving on to number 9, the West Mesa bone collector. Back in 2009, a woman on a leisurely walk with her dog came across something peculiar. A human bone. Little did she know, she'd stumbled upon a major crime scene. Upon her discovery, authorities became immediately involved and discovered that it was a mass grave filled with human remains. But how did they get there? A killer dubbed the West Mesa Bone Collector. Active between 2001 to 2005, the killer was known to target young women, usually Hispanic and almost always involved in late night services or the trade, but not exclusively, which made it hard to identify why he chose his victims. While we know practically nothing about the killer, we do know that he would take the bodies to the desert to dispose of them. After years of police investigation, the remains of 11 women were found scattered in the deserts of Albuquerque, but the exact way they died is yet to be discovered, as medical examiners and forensic experts have not been able to identify his methods, which is very unusual. Sadly, neither police or FBI have ever been able to track down who was responsible for ending these young women's lives, and I am sure the agents on the case are continually disturbed by the fact that he remains on the loose. Moving on to number 8. Glendon Scott Crawford. In 2012, Glendon Scott Crawford, who was a part of the Pointy Hat white supremacist group, conspired with a guy named Eric Fate to turn an industrial-grade X-ray radiation device into a weapon of mass destruction. The plan was to have a remote-controlled death ray he could use on Muslims in the United States, targeting mosques, community centers, and so on. So Crawford sought assistance from Chris Barker, one of the Imperial Wizards in his hate group. However, what Crawford did not know was that Barker, in an effort to handle his own felony charges, had become an informant for the FBI. This led to another FBI agent coming on the case undercover, and eventually, once there was enough evidence stacked against Crawford's plan to commit acts of he was sentenced to 30 years behind bars. Still, I can only imagine how disturbing it must have been for those undercover agents to be in the same room with such a disgusting man. Moving on to number 7, Richard Trenton Chase. Often referred to as the Vampire of Sacramento, Chase was a truly terrifying killer who took the life of 6 people in just 1 month back in 1977. Before he turned to human victims, Chase would capture animals and bring them back to his apartment to kill and disembowel. From there, he would eat them raw, sometimes mixing them with Coca-Cola in his blender. Then in 1973, Chase was forcibly admitted to an institution after being taken to emergency for trying to inject rabbit's blood into his veins. While in the facility, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and became known as the Vampire, as he all too often killed animals and drank their blood. But by 1976, he was deemed no longer a threat to society and released back into his mother's custody. Tragically, she began weaning him off his medication, believing he didn't really need it, and once again he slipped into old habits. But this time it wasn't birds and rabbits Chase was harming, he was breaking into homes and killing people before treating them just as he did his animals. Eventually he was put on trial for his 6 victims, and a jury ruled him guilty, rejecting the defense's attempt that he could not be tried due to insanity. Chase was sentenced to death, but ended up taking his own life while behind bars before his execution. Coming in at number 6, Daniela Green. Born in Germany, Daniela moved to the US with her family before she was hired as a contract linguist for the FBI in 2011. While working at the FBI, they made use of her bilingual skills and ended up assigning her to a German terror criminal known as Individual A at the time. Through research, Green discovered her subject was a former rap artist named Dennis Kuisbert who had joined, that group, and over time, Green found ways to correspond with Kuisbert. However, in a shocking turn of events, their relationship turned romantic. Soon, Green made secretive plans to fly out to Syria and meet him, and within hours of her arrival, the two got married. But it didn't take long before she realized what a mess she found herself in and ended up emailing an acquaintance for help. Within 5 weeks, American authorities caught up to her. Green was arrested and returned to the US, but was released after only 9 months in jail, and the FBI spun her involvement with Kuisbert as that of an unsuspecting linguist duped by a conniving criminal. Still, I can only imagine how disturbing it must have been for everyone involved, knowing that one of their own had double-crossed them and married the literal enemy they were trying to take down. Next up at number 5, Robert Hansen. Known in the media as the Butcher Baker, Hansen was an extremely sick killer who quite literally viewed his victims as prey. In his adolescence, Robert was an awkward and shy boy who had absolutely no luck with girls. These early rejections festered into a deep hatred for women, for which he later would seek revenge. As he got older, he began finding solace in archery and hunting, and would routinely spend his time perfecting his craft alone in the woods. Then, in the early 1960s, he began seeking revenge, at first by committing arson on his high school property, but then soon turned to seek revenge on women specifically. By 1971, he was kidnapping and taking advantage of women, but not yet killing. He was charged and sentenced to 5 years for his crimes, but after just 6 months was released on a work program. After his release is where it really got scary. He began kidnapping women and escorts, taking them back to his apartment where he would do awful things to their bodies, before flying them out to secluded areas in the wilderness and telling them he was going to hunt them down and kill them. Tragically, an estimated 21 women lost their lives to this monster, but thankfully he was convicted and sentenced to 461 years in prison without possibility of parole. Moving on to number 4. Albert Fish. Also known as the Brooklyn Vampire, Albert Fish was a terrifying killer responsible for the death of 3 people in the mid-1920s, although according to him, it was well over 100. Fish grew up in an unstable home. Both his parents suffered from mental illness, and after his father died, he was sent to live at an orphanage. While there, he was by the other orphans, but he started to develop a rather confusing feeling towards the pain. He began to enjoy it. As Fish got older, he started seeking darker and more twisted things to feel alive, and soon that led to the kidnapping, taking advantage of, killing, and later devouring of minors. Thankfully, the monster was caught in 1935, and shockingly, he wasted no time denying his atrocities. In fact, he almost seemed proud of them. I can't, and frankly won't, go into detail about what he did, but it is some of the most disgusting stuff I have ever read about. And I can only imagine the agents on his case felt the same. Eventually, Fish was sentenced to death and died by electric chair in 1936. After his death, his lawyer refused to release his final statement, saying, quote, "I will never show it to anyone. It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read." Next up at number 3, Michael James Pratt. Currently on the FBI's top 10 most wanted, I can only imagine how disturbed the FBI was when they first became aware of this case. Between approximately 2012 to 2019, Michael Pratt, along with a few accomplices, was involved in recruiting underage girls to be a part of an adult film production company that he owned and operated. Pratt lured the girls in under Craigslist ads asking for models, and from there he promised payment in exchange for a clothes clothed modeling gig. But sadly, this couldn't have been further from what he had planned for the victims. Beyond the obviously morally despicable stuff they were making these girls do, he would also force past victims into providing false assurance to the girls that their films would never end up online. Allegedly, some of the victims were not permitted to leave locations until the shoot was completed, others were forced to perform after declining participation, and the crew was also known to commit SA when the girls wouldn't comply. After fleeing the country in 2019, right before his trial for his crimes, he was added to the FBI list, and the search for this creep continues. Moving on to number 2, Mark Putnam. In the mid-1980s, Mark Putnam was a happy husband, father, and successful FBI agent. But after relocating to the Bureau's Pikeville office, things began to change. At this time, Carl Edwards Lockhart, a notorious bank robber, had just been let out of prison, and Putnam believed that he was back to his old ways. So he began gathering informants that could help him take down Lockhart. One of these informants was Susan Smith, addicted divorcee raising a family who needed the cash. But soon, she became more than just Putnam's informant. The two began an affair, and by 1989, Smith was allegedly pregnant. This terrified Putnam. He knew it would not only ruin his marriage, but end his career, and so he demanded a paternity test and explained he and his wife could adopt from her. This, however, led to a violent fight between them that ultimately ended with Putnam strangling Susan to death. Initially, the suspect was Susan's ex-husband, but soon Putnam was interrogated, and after failing a polygraph, he confessed to the whole thing and offered to lead the FBI to where she was. However, there are a few mysteries. Susan Smith's sister claimed that FBI agent Ron Poole, Putnam's superior, not only knew about Smith's alleged pregnancy, but also disclosed to Smith information about Putnam's illicit activities with other informants. And allegedly, medical examiners claimed that they were unable to find any trace of a fetus during an autopsy on Smith, who should have been 4 months pregnant. I mean, it's just all disturbing top to bottom. And last up in our number 1 spot, the Brianna Dennison case. Brianna Dennison was a college student home for the holidays in Reno, Nevada, when tragically one night she went missing while staying over at a friend's house. In the days following, the Reno Police Department conducted an investigation at her friend's home where she had last been seen and concluded she had been abducted after discovering male DNA on a doorknob and her own blood on a pillowcase. At this point, the FBI became involved in the search, and after investigations linked the male DNA to other open cases involving sexually violent crimes, they worried that the missing girl's fate had already been decided. And sadly, nearly a month after she had gone missing, Brianna was found dead in a ditch. That fall, after lengthy investigations, interrogations, and DNA samples, they finally found the man guilty of the crime, James Biella. And it came out that he had actually held her captive in his home for several days, harming and doing awful things to her body before he eventually killed her. And to top it off, he lived 1 block from FBI agents, 2 sheriffs, and a local police officer. So he was literally doing it all under their nose. Well, that's all I have for you today, friends. I hope you liked this one, and make sure to hit that subscribe button before you go. See you next time.
Discover America's most haunted cities. Haunted American cities that you might be living in. Check out the video now to find out more. You'll be sure to thank us later when you find out you live in the most haunted city in America.